Today is Tuesday, October 4th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. So happy St. Francis Day, if you're listening. As I said, it's October 4th today. I had a few requests this week in discussions for a walk talk topic, and I'm happy to take one of them up today. And the first topic that I was asked about is the question of the death penalty or capital punishment. It seems, if we listen to the headlines, listen to things reported in the news, of course, none of us have first-hand sources on these things. We're always reading through the grapevine, as it were. But it seems that the Pope and the Church in general, because while the Pope is often criticized and picked on, there's hardly any issue that the Pope speaks on publicly that the bishops don't agree with the Pope on. So it's kind of silly to isolate the Pope and pretend that he just comes up with all of this stuff on his own when he's saying things that are agreed on by all the bishops as well. Maybe we can find a few maverick bishops and drag them around from conference to conference and use them as props, but for the most part, the bishops and the Pope are like-minded on just about everything. So let's remember that anytime we talk about what the Pope said or the Pope suggested or anything like that, all the bishops think the same way. So it really is the mind of the church speaking, the mind of the hierarchy of the church. But we see this message that the hierarchy of the church, normally with the Pope acting as the mouthpiece for the hierarchy of the church, is strongly discouraging the use of the death penalty. And for some reason, Catholics who love to object to anything the Pope says will throw a tantrum when they hear these things, as if the Pope is saying that no one is allowed to use the death penalty. Obviously, that's not true, and that's not what the Pope is saying, and he's probably clarified that a million times, but the Pope's critics will pretend that he's running off the rails and arguing that any government who uses the death penalty is acting immorally. And they'll say this is some crazy liberal position. The Pope loves criminals and wants the world to be filled with violent crime and all kinds of nonsense like that. That's obviously not what the Pope is teaching. So let's think through this and talk about it a little bit, because I think this is really an easy controversy to deal with. If we were to ask the question, does the state have the right to put a criminal to death? It's a very easy answer. The answer is yes. And some people might go to the Old Testament law, the law of Moses, and pull out Bible verses that talk about putting people to death. We can even go back through Christian history and show that Christian monarchs, Christian states all through history put criminals to death. The Catholic Church, when it held political power, put evildoers to death. We can go back through history and show all of these examples, but none of them would be demonstrative that we should put people to death today. So that doesn't prove anything. If we want to prove the issue today, we can't merely turn back to historical examples and say, well, they did it there, therefore we can do it now. That really isn't reasonable. So we can't just do that. We can't just say, they killed people in the 1300s, therefore we can kill people today. That's not demonstrative in any way. That simply means our morality is similar to that of another generation, which isn't what it means to be perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect, which is Christ's actual command to us. So we've got to ask the question, what sort of universal principle, universal truth directs us on these issues? We have to ask questions like, what's the purpose of capital punishment? And when we say what's the purpose, I mean, what is it just? What is the proper purpose of the death penalty? Is the purpose of the death penalty to simply carry out revenge on behalf of the victim upon the head of the criminal? That's one option. Is it to actually make reparation for a violent crime or a death caused by the criminal? That may be the case. Is it to cause possible future murderers or criminals to think twice before they act, knowing that they're going to be executed if they do so? That may be the case. So we've got all of these different moral issues to sort through, and we have to try to figure out where all of this should begin. And as Aristotle would teach us in the Ethics, we should start out by asking, well, what is the target of all of our moral activity? What are we trying to actually carry out? And some will say, well, we want to promote the common good. Oh, that's true, humanly speaking. But if you limit the scope of the human good or the common good to this life, then you're not talking like a Christian anymore. Because man wasn't created for this life alone. Man was created to live happily with God forever. And therefore, we can't simply take what Aristotle, as a secular philosopher who lived 350 years before Christ, we can't simply take what he says to be, or what he says appears to be, the chief end of man, and apply that in 2000 AD. That doesn't make much sense. So we've got to think a little more carefully than that. And we've got to remember that anytime we consult an authority, we have to do so with respect to the context, to the historical context, to the context in terms of whether we're talking about Christian teaching or pre-Christian teaching that's based on human reason in philosophy, or teaching that's based on the light of divine revelation. We've got to take the context into consideration. Aristotle is helpful with respect to philosophy, but divine revelation requires us to think beyond the limits of Aristotle's secular worldview. We've got more to think about as Christians. So we can't simply say the promotion of the common good as it applies to life in this world is the chief end of man, or the chief end even of government. Government itself, human government, has to be subject and imitate divine government. Jesus teaches us in the Lord's Prayer to pray, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." We're commanded by St. Paul to be imitators of God. That's the principle, to be imitators of God. So let's start there. When we think about the death penalty, if someone commits a crime, someone kills another person, let's say murders another person, does God instantly kill that person? No, God does not instantly kill that person. Does God command that that person be punished? Yes, God does command that that person be punished. Does God command that that person be punished with the death penalty? That's a little more complicated. We can go back to the Old Testament to what are called the Noahide laws, or the laws of the covenant of Noah, which is significant, way back to the early chapters of the book of Genesis. And if you read the story of Noah's flood, after the flood ends and the waters subside and Noah and his sons get out of the ark and basically start the human race all over again, God makes a covenant with Noah. And what's significant about this is that it's a covenant between God and all human beings. It's different from the law of Moses, because the law of Moses was not a covenant between God and all human beings. The law of Moses was a covenant between God and the people of Israel. But the covenant that God made with Noah was a covenant between God and all men. And therefore it's very significant, because it's the foundation of human law outside of Israel. The Jews refer to these as the laws of the Gentiles. I think they have another name for it, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. But the Jews, if you were to ask a Jewish man, I'm not a Jew. Do I need to keep the law of Moses? Do I need to obey the 10 Commandments? Do I need to keep the Sabbath day and so on? The Jew would tell you, no, you don't have to keep the law of Moses, because you're not a Jew. If you're a Gentile, you can serve God by simply obeying the covenant that God made with Noah. That's what a Jewish man would tell you if you were a non-Jew. He would tell you you're responsible to keep the laws of the Gentiles according to the covenant of Noah. And what God says there in the covenant of Noah is essentially that any man who sheds another man's blood is to have his blood shed by man. And so when God speaks to Noah and his sons, he says that murder is to be punished by the death, or through the death of the murderer. So that's true. According to the laws of Noah, in the beginning, basically, of the second iteration of the population of the world, it was said to Noah that if a man killed another man, his blood should be shed. And this is where we would say this is the authorization for human law enforcement and courts and things like that. We would point back to the law of Noah. And it looks like, from what we read there, something like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. A principle that whatever a man does to another man, he should have the same done to himself. And we know that even in the New Testament, God teaches the same principle, though in different ways, but a similar principle. And maybe the teaching of the New Testament actually enlightens God's intention and real meaning in what he said in the Old Testament. Jesus, for example, says, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. In other words, do unto us as we do unto others. That's the principle of justice. Jesus warns and says, as you judge others, so God will judge you. He tells us to be merciful so that God may be merciful to us. There is this same principle of judgment or justice in the New Testament. And so it seems that the principle that God teaches is that what a man does in terms of crime against his neighbor, he should suffer a punishment that makes some kind of reparation for that crime. And he should pay that reparation of his own resources. That's the idea of justice with respect to a man committing a crime. So we have to ask the question about capital punishment. What crime, or for which crime I should say, is capital punishment a reasonable and just penalty? And I think this is the real issue here. So if a man commits murder, obviously it would be just for the state, and we're always talking about the state. We're not talking about individuals going out and carrying out what they consider to be justice on their own. That's not what's taught anywhere in Scripture. But it's the idea that there is an estate established with authority from God, as St. Paul explains in Romans chapter 13. He explains that the authorities that exist on the earth are established by God, and the state does not bear the sword in vain, but that the state is in fact God's minister that executes vengeance upon those who do evil, that the state is authorized to use the sword in the administration of justice. And by the sword is signified capital punishment, or at least it appears that capital punishment is signified by this use of the sword as a rhetorical figure. So that's clear from Romans chapter 13 that the state has the authority by formal means of investigation into individual cases, considering all the evidence and considering what a just penalty might be. The state is authorized to use the death penalty. But as I said before, it doesn't suggest that the state can use the death penalty as it pleases. For example, maybe I should hold off on saying this, but the state can't say in a draconian way, this is what it means to be draconian, that you sort of carry out severe punishments regardless of the crime, to try and discourage crime, but the criminals who suffer are not being punished justly. They're being punished excessively. So we could say, you know what? Anyone who breaks the law gets the death penalty. And that would sound ridiculous, but it's simply worth considering as a principle. Does the state have the authority to use the death penalty as it pleases? Can the state simply say, anyone who breaks these laws, stealing, prostitution, money laundering, tax fraud, any of these crimes that we list will be punished with death? Does the state have the authority to bear the sword however it pleases? And the answer is no. It's got to be within the limits of what is just. And that's the real dilemma here. The dilemma is what is actually just. And we've got to consider this from a number of different viewpoints. First of all, we've got to realize that the punishment has to fit. It can never exceed the evil done by the crime itself. The punishment can't be more grievous than the crime. And so really the execution of the intentional execution of a criminal cannot be used for the punishment of an unintentional death. and therefore manslaughter cannot be justly punished with the death penalty. That would not be just. The man is intentionally put to death for an unintentional death. That's not just. And so we'd have to get into differences in the nature of crimes and whether the death penalty, which is the most severe penalty that we can possibly issue, would actually be just in a specific case. Just because one person causes the death of another does not mean that the death penalty is the necessary punishment for that crime. That's not necessarily true. It certainly does not appear true that the death penalty could be used for the punishment of other crimes. For example, in the case of a rape, how could we argue that a person who rapes another person must be punished with a punishment equal to the loss of his life? That doesn't seem to be just, and you may disagree with me on that. That's the kind of question that I think is worth disputing. And obviously there will be some places that will execute a rapist. But is the loss of life really equivalent in evil to, or equivalent in justice to the evil of a rape? That's a debatable question. And sometimes it's hard to determine what the just punishment would actually be. And you could see how these things could get quite grotesque in the wrong hands. So we have to think of these things in a civilized way. We have to ask the question, how can we carry out the punishment of a crime in civilized ways? Okay? We don't necessarily want to turn to some draconian law and just execute strict judgment for all crimes. We also don't want to turn to something like Hammurabi's code with an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which is proper for a crude society, I would say, a brutal ancient society, but not a civilized and developed society. I mean, it would be pretty disgusting to be walking around with fellow citizens missing eyes and hands and having their tongues cut out. I wouldn't want to live in a society like that, and I don't think that would be considered civilized. That might have been appropriate at a certain time in history, but it doesn't appear to be appropriate in modern history, at least if we consider ourselves to be to some degree civilized. And so that brings us to the question of imprisonment and monetary fines and things like that. We try to punish crimes in a civilized way because, as I said, we don't want the punishment of criminals to actually make the lives of the innocent miserable. We want to punish them, and this may sound funny, but we want to punish them in a convenient way. I don't want my life to be disturbed or disrupted by another man's crime. I would like that man who committed his own crime to suffer the consequences of his crime in his own way. That is, in a way that makes him inconvenienced, not that inconveniences others. That's the challenge of these things. And so this is where we come to the prison system, the use of imprisonment, monetary fines, and things like that. Even other means of shaming, like we have today. We have the sex offenders lists that are published. You go online and there's directories with the pictures and the addresses of men who've been convicted of some kinds of sexual crimes. That sort of public shaming. There are many different means by which crimes can be punished, we don't necessarily have to always run to bloodshed and, brutality. And that's why, the law prevents things like what are called cruel and unusual punishments. We want to be civilized. We want to allow the innocent to enjoy a good life. We don't want the entire life of the community made grotesque and uncomfortable because other people have committed crime. So there's other factors in this than simply seeking to punish criminals in a way that's equivalent to the gravity of the crimes committed. These are complicated issues to think through. We don't want to spite ourselves and punish the whole society for an individual's crime. So whenever we consider the punishment of crime in civilized society, we have to ask, how does the community want a crime to be punished? What punishments are considered effective and desirable by the community, by the state itself? And that's pretty well defined in our society. Now, what the Pope is talking about when he discourages the use of the death penalty is that in the 21st century, is it civilized? Is it necessary? Is it desirable, with all things considered, to be executing people as a means of punishment? If we think about society, if we think about the spirit of the modern age, if we think about the culture in which we live, is it desirable to punish crimes with death? And what we have to think about is, what might the consequences of this be? What might the consequences be of us sending people to the electric chair, or to lethal injection, or death by firing squad, or the guillotine? What effect would this means of punishing crime have on our society? Would it actually do more harm than good? And if we look at our society and we say, what are the evils that are plaguing our society? And we say, well, modern society is characterized as a culture of death. We hear this phrase, culture of death. We look at abortion and we say, it looks like human beings in the modern world have no respect for human life. That men and women would seek to procure abortions almost recreationally, or as a means of preserving their career advancement. They would consider the life of an unborn child to be not as valuable as a promotion in the office, or as the completion of a college degree. And we look at our society and we say, man, there just seems to be a lack of respect for the value of human life. There's talk about putting elderly people to death, legalizing physician-assisted suicide, because these people who reach old age are considered to be burdensome, that their life is not worth living, and that they should simply be put to sleep because they're no longer able to earn a living or live without disturbing others. It seems that our generation doesn't have a respect for human life. Now, in that context, with that in mind, do we want to add to that darkness by now using the death penalty as a means of punishing crimes? Do we want to go along with this current of human disposal for the so-called common good? After all, abortion is said to be done for the common good. Physician-assisted suicide is promoted as being for the common good. Do we want to get into that current and move along with society in general, with this view that the disposal of human beings is a means of promoting the common good, making our society happier and safer and more prosperous and so on? Or does the current spirit of the age, as it were, require us to consider alternatives that represent a resistance to that spirit of this age? To say, look, while it might be just to punish this or that crime with execution, considering our society's lack of respect for life, we believe that the use of execution as a means of punishment for criminal activity would actually further this culture of death rather than work against it or hinder it in some way. So, maybe in this context, with all these things considered, the use of the death penalty as a means of punishing crime needs to be avoided. And I would argue that this is what the Pope and bishops have in mind. We're working so hard to try to promote a respect for the dignity of human life, that to be shipping people off to the electric chair week by week would undermine the effort that we're actually making to promote respect for life. And therefore, while in the consideration of the individual, that punishment may be just, in respect to what is best and necessary for the common good, it may not be desirable. It may be lawful, but not profitable. And St. Paul talks about this. He talks about how some things may be lawful for him, that he has a right to do them, but considering his mission, considering the effects that this or that action might have on others, it's not profitable for him, and therefore, even though he has the right to do it, he'll abstain from that thing because of the broader implications or consequences of what that action might do to affect the community. So there's more to this than just individual justice. There's also the consideration of the spirit and problems that exist in society and whether our behavior, though lawful, may not be profitable. And that's what's to be considered. Now, when we add to this advantages and benefits of modern society, like secure prison facilities, technology for the tracking of criminals, all of these technological advances, we have to ask the question, for the promotion of the welfare of the common good, is it really necessary? Is it really necessary to put a person to death in order to justly punish an individual for a crime committed? Or do our circumstances in the 21st century allow us to deal with these things in a different way, a more thoughtful way? a way that's not short-sighted, but that considers the implications, the ramifications of these means of punishment as well. And that's what I would argue the Pope and bishops are urging governments to consider, whether in the big picture of how society is going, as it were, whether thoughtlessly or maybe lazily or selfishly just taking this easy route and putting criminals to death. Maybe it's cheaper to do that. Maybe it's easier, less troublesome, and so on. To consider whether it's actually better or whether it may actually be contributing to the problem that we're seeking to eliminate in the first place, which is a carelessness with regard to human life. So it's a complicated issue. And as I said, in modern society, there are a lot of complicating factors to be considered. How can technology help us? How can the quality of prison facilities, when I mean quality, I mean the fact that prison facilities are capable of keeping criminals secure. How do these modern developments change the equation or open new doors to be considered in the preservation of the common good? These are controversial questions. And it seems that the Pope and bishops are urging governments to discuss these things and ask whether alternative methods might be employed that would be better and would send a better message to the society at large, try to promote a respect for human life, starting at the top and saying, look, as the authorized government of this state, I have the right, or we have the right, to respond to this crime committed with this penalty of death. But the dignity of human life moves us to not exercise this right, which is lawful, but rather to seek an alternative means of protecting the community without the further shedding of human blood and loss of human life. And that would be leading society by example, saying, please, respect your neighbor, respect life, love your neighbor, imitate the state in its example of respecting human life. That's a broader view of justice to be considered. And I would argue again that that's what the Pope and bishops are trying to promote. Now, all of that talk, all of that has been limited to secular or worldly considerations. We've just been talking about human justice in secular society. We haven't considered the greater and true chief end of human life, which is to enjoy God forever. And this pushes the discussion even further. If it is possible to safely contain criminals, and if it is possible to track and monitor criminals, and if it is possible to avoid the use of the death penalty, would it not also promote the opportunity for men who have made criminal choices in the past to have God's mercy extended to them, have the gospel continually preached to them, have prayers and sacrifices continually offered for them, that their souls might, by the grace of God and by the intercession of the saints, come to contrition and penance and eternal life. And would this not be the greatest good? All things considered, would this not be the greatest possible good, the most excellent possible outcome? And I think the answer for that would be yes. And I've heard people argue to the contrary. I've heard someone argue once, if facing the death penalty and sitting on death row with 2 months to live doesn't bring a person to the point of contrition and penance, maybe nothing will. But the key word is maybe. Maybe nothing will. And remember, go back to the Gospels where Jesus is warning us. Unless you forgive men their offenses, your heavenly Father will not forgive your offenses. Be merciful. And so on. When we consider all these things, what is the best possible outcome? And may we not pursue the best possible outcome? And then the next argument rises. Well, who's going to pay for this? And you see how the next wave of discussions becomes a set of discussions that I don't think anyone wants to represent the other side in. Nobody wants to be the one to make the argument that it's not worth, financially speaking, it's not worth keeping a person alive. What's really bizarre about people when they argue these things is that by the time they're finished, the same arguments are coming out of their mouth when speaking in support of the death penalty as we find coming out of the mouths of the people fighting for the right to abort their children. The arguments are almost identical. It's not convenient for us to keep this person alive. This person's existence continues to put us at risk. And we get into this dark, selfish, really pessimistic spirit that doesn't want to be inconvenienced by the preservation of a certain person's life. And I really don't think we want to be the ones making that kind of an argument. And if we do, we can see how we're projecting a message of hypocrisy when we turn around and scold anyone considering an abortion who offers the same kind of reasons, the same kind of selfish, worldly arguments to defend their right to do with their bodies what they please, their so-called reproductive rights. If we want to be strong in the pro-life movement, we have to lead that movement by example. And when we are the ones who have the choices to make to end or preserve life, we have to model the respect for life and the hope for positive outcomes that we turn around and tell the pro-choice crowd that they should seek in the decisions that they have to make. We tell them to trust in God, to hope in God, to believe that good can come out of even the darkest circumstances. We think of isolated examples where good did come out of bad situations, where a woman who was raped chose to keep the baby and bring that baby into the world, and it ended up with a happy story, with a happy ending. We point to these examples and say, look, good can come out of these circumstances. If we're going to give that counsel to women considering abortion who face what appears to them to be impossible circumstances, we need to act and judge with that same hope in the treatment of criminals. Otherwise, the pro-choice crowd watches us say one thing to them about what they should do, and then turn around and do the opposite when it's our turn to make a decision. And this is why the pro-life movement gets no respect from the pro-choice crowd, because they're seen as being hypocritical. And I think we have to agree it is hypocritical. And these are the kind of things that I believe the Pope and bishops are trying to urge Christian people, to urge secular leaders to think about as they make these decisions. What would the best possible outcome be? The best possible outcome. And can we not hope, considering the circumstances of modern life and technology, considering the possibility that even one criminal, by time, by patience, by mercy, could come to repentance? Would it not be worth the cost of keeping such people alive? Jesus tells us in the gospel, just in light of this, thinking about this, that if a shepherd has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 and go and seek that one that went astray? And when he finds that one sheep that was lost, does he not come back rejoicing with that one sheep? And so we see this idea that it's not worth it. Can't possibly be argued. Jesus said in the gospel, the Son of Man has come to seek and save that which was lost. And do we think it's coincidental? Do we think it's coincidental that a thief was crucified with Christ and received mercy, whereas from the secular government he was shown no mercy? I'm sure that some can interpret that to say, well, that shows us that we should kill the criminal and leave mercy to God. But Jesus, in that moment, was in the flesh, acting as a representative of man, modeling for us obedience to the will of the Father. And he was speaking to the criminal, not with the harshness of the Roman governor, but with mercy. Not even talking about the man's sin, not even talking about the man's crime or past, but talking about the man's present state and his future happiness. It's an interesting discussion. It's a controversial discussion, and you can see how there are these mini controversies all throughout this macro controversy of the death penalty. But if we get ourselves out of the arrogance and shallowness and emotion of the political party disputes, not even considering the criminals, But considering ourselves before God, where our salvation will depend entirely on God receiving our plea for mercy, what would the best response be? What response would merit for us, by God's grace, the best possible response from God Himself when we stand before God and are judged according to the measure with which we have measured in our lives? If we have the opportunity to show mercy without causing greater harm, then I think it's in our interest to show mercy. And I think the argument can be made that the common good can be protected, victims can be justly served in the justice that they deserve, and criminals can also be shown respect, not as criminals, but as human beings. And a message projected of respect for human life, while at the same time promoting justice in society. Will it come at greater public expense? Probably so. But everything good comes at greater public expense. And if the greater public expense, if we knew that the greater public expense that was incurred for the best possible outcome, wouldn't it be an increased public expense that we as a society took pride in and pointed to as a sign of our virtue? I think it would. And again, if we're wrapped up in party politics and we see our political opponents as our actual enemies, rather than mere opponents on controversial issues, then we can get wrapped up in this and get all emotional and upset about it just because we want to win every political argument. But I think if we think about it with the best possible outcome in mind, best long-term outcome in mind, then I think we can understand that the urging of the Pope and bishops to refrain from the use of the death penalty unless absolutely necessary is good counsel and should be heeded by modern states for all those reasons. Now, you have to realize that this is also asked in the context of a society, an American society, which is crazy, which has taken up this Second Amendment controversy as a political contest, where the so-called far-right Americans interpret the Second Amendment to authorize the execution of thieves by things like these stand your ground laws, where a person is told that if someone breaks into your home, whether or not they pose any actual threat to your life, you have the right to put them to death by the use of lethal force. And to point to the Second Amendment as the justification for the killing of robbers, you see that we've gone off to the opposite extreme. And again, if you listen to the language, if you listen to the arguments of the people arguing for this so-called right to self-defense, you'll find that it runs almost parallel to the pro-choice arguments. The words that come out of their mouths are almost the exact same words that come out of the mouths of the people justifying abortion. But it's my stuff, but it's my home. No one has the right to do something with my property that I don't authorize. I have the right to protect myself, and so on. Same language. We never heard these words, we never heard these arguments in the mouth of Christ while he lived. And yet somehow this gets associated with Christianity, and it's just very bizarre how this modern Christian nationalism, this right-wing political message associates with Christianity. Very strange. But we can see that this crowd is off to the opposite extreme, going far beyond anything that's actually just, and just looking for the justification to go beyond any authorized degree of punishment ever authorized by anything but the most draconian and ruthless, barbaric societies. To put a robber to death by execution. You can see how this has just swung far, far beyond any reasonable idea of justice. We literally value our possessions more than the life of our neighbor. And is that not the problem with abortion? Is that not exactly what we're arguing about when it comes to abortion? That a mother or a father considers his possessions or his convenience or his security, his personal safety, more important than the life of another person? It's the same problem, but somehow the abortion is demonized and the execution of a common thief justified. It makes no sense. And this is the kind of moral hypocrisy and self-contradiction that I believe the church is calling to our attention. And most of the complaining is just the usual negative response to anything that the Pope says. It's not reasonable. If it's in our power to save the lives of criminals while also punishing them, and also knowing that God has already told us that we have no obligation to execute vengeance. God has already told us, vengeance is mine, I will repay. We don't need to feel that we have some burden of carrying out the universal justice, or God's justice may fail. That's just ridiculous. God is going to judge all men with perfect justice. And we have to consider what the real purpose is of these methods of punishment, and whether in our society, all things considered, with the best possible outcomes in mind, whether they really ought to be employed, even though they're lawful and right. Just because something can be done doesn't necessarily mean that it should be done. That's the real question. I know this is a controversial topic, and I trust that thinking through it like this and talking about it may have raised some new questions that we might discuss or take up, or hopefully one of the real advantages of discussing topics like this is we begin to see what the crucial questions, the crucial issues really are. And it helps us to really zero in on the key points in these dilemmas. So if you feel that there's been any question like that, that's sort of risen to the surface, I'd love to know about it. Comment. Let me know your thoughts. If you'd like to object to anything that I've said, don't write a 50-page comment in response. No one's going to read that. Object to a specific point. Raise an objection to a specific statement or claim. And that way we can actually examine whether something said or something thought might be false. And that may be a key point in this discussion. But feel free to comment or add some other thoughts. I hope that's helpful. God bless you all.